Silence after a breakup isn't neutral. It's doing something to you, whether you've named it yet or not. There's a specific kind of silence that follows certain breakups. Not the silence of mutual closure or agreed distance, but the kind that lingers without explanation, that stretches across days and then weeks, heavy and uninterrupted. It doesn't announce itself as rejection. It just settles in, filling the space where communication used to live. And what most people don't realize is that this silence isn't passive. It's active. It's working on you, psychologically, emotionally, physiologically, in ways that become clear only after the damage is already structural. Understanding what's happening during that silence requires looking past the surface, past what someone says they need, and into the behavioral patterns that reveal what's actually occurring beneath the quiet. Relationship psychology operates on feedback. The mind uses interaction to regulate itself, to confirm connection, to establish safety within attachment. When that feedback stops, the system doesn't rest. It recalibrates. Emotional behavior begins shifting the moment communication drops off, even when the conscious mind insists everything is fine. The nervous system registers absence as data, and that data, unresolved, unexplained, ongoing, triggers responses that don't require your permission to unfold. This isn't about weakness. It's about how humans are wired. Psychological dynamics depend on reciprocity, on rhythm, on the back and forth that confirms you're not alone in the space you're occupying. When that rhythm breaks, the silence fills in, and the absence itself becomes a presence you can't ignore. What makes post-breakup silence so disorienting is its ambiguity. There's no closure, no boundary, no clear endpoint. Just a person who was once present, now gone, with no explanation for how long or why. Behavior analysis shows that ambiguity destabilizes attachment patterns faster than clarity ever could. The mind searches for meaning in the gap, constructing narratives to explain what the silence won't. And in that process, emotional distance grows, not just between two people, but within the person left waiting. They begin to question their perception, their worth, their read of what was real. The silence doesn't just separate, it distorts. And the longer it lasts, the deeper that distortion runs. This isn't about what your ex is thinking. It's about what silence does to the human mind when connection is removed without resolution. It's about the patterns that emerge when presence is replaced by absence, when communication is replaced by interpretation, when clarity is replaced by waiting. The psychological dynamics at play here are universal. They don't require intent. They don't require cruelty. They just require time and distance and the absence of words. And if you've been sitting in that silence, feeling it press against you in ways you can't quite name, you're not imagining it, you're experiencing it. And what follows is an examination of exactly what that experience is doing, and why it matters more than most people realize. The silence doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, often dressed in language that sounds reasonable. Time apart, breathing room, a need to think. There's no dramatic exit, no door slammed shut. Just a gradual reduction in presence that feels intentional enough to respect, vague enough to misread. This is where relationship psychology becomes difficult to interpret, because the behavior itself carries no clear boundary. It presents as consideration, as maturity, as something temporary. And because it feels like care, it doesn't trigger immediate alarm. The mind accepts it as neutral, even necessary. But silence, even when soft, is never passive. It creates space, yes, but space is not empty. It fills with interpretation, with waiting, with the absence of confirmation. Emotional behavior begins shifting the moment communication slows, even if neither person acknowledges it yet. The nervous system notices before the mind does. There's a faint sense of imbalance, a slight pull toward checking, toward wondering. Nothing sharp, just a low hum of uncertainty that wasn't there before. The attachment patterns that once felt secure begin to sense something missing, though the logic still resists naming it. What makes this phase deceptive is its familiarity. People need space. Relationships need room to breathe. These are truths, and they provide cover for something else. Something less about restoration and more about retreat. Psychological dynamics shift not because of what's said, but because of what isn't. The absence of reassurance becomes its own message, even when no message was intended. Behavior analysis starts here, in the gap between what someone says they need and what their actions quietly communicate. The silence feels mutual at first, but the weight of it rarely is. And so it begins, not with a choice, but with a drift. The emotional distance grows incrementally, almost invisibly, because it's wrapped in language that sounds like healing. But distance, once introduced, doesn't pause on its own. It either closes or it expands. The body starts to sense this long before the mind allows the thought. Something has shifted in the rhythm. The question is whether anyone will name it before the silence becomes the relationship's new language. Because once it does, the patterns that follow are rarely accidental. The first few days carry a strange neutrality. There's no crisis, no confrontation, just an absence that could mean anything. Messages slow down. Calls don't happen. Plans dissolve without being canceled. The silence isn't hostile, but it isn't warm either. It exists in a space where interpretation becomes the only tool available. And interpretation without data is just projection. Relationship dynamics begin to fracture here, not from conflict, but from the lack of clarity. The mind searches for meaning in behavior that offers none. And because nothing is explicitly wrong, nothing can be explicitly addressed. The ambiguity itself becomes the problem. This is where emotional behavior starts to split. One person might read the quiet as healthy distance, a sign of respect for boundaries. The other begins to feel it as withdrawal, a subtle but growing absence of investment. Neither is wrong. Both are reacting to the same silence, but through different attachment patterns. The person initiating the space often feels relief, a break from intensity, from expectation, from the weight of being needed. The person receiving it feels something else, a faint erosion of security, a question mark where certainty used to sit. The silence doesn't clarify, it divides. What makes this phase so psychologically disorienting is that nothing has been decided. There's no breakup, no boundary set, no conversation that closes the loop, just a slowdown that could reverse at any moment, or couldn't. Behavior analysis shows that humans tolerate ambiguity poorly, especially in relationships. The nervous system craves resolution. When it doesn't come, the mind fills in the gaps, often inaccurately. Hope and doubt begin to alternate, sometimes within the same hour. One text could shift everything. One call could reset the balance. But neither comes. And the longer the silence stretches, the heavier it becomes. The unsettling part isn't the quiet itself. It's the realization that the quiet is being chosen. Not once, but repeatedly. Every hour that passes without contact is a decision, even if it doesn't feel like one. Psychological dynamics shift when absence becomes consistent. The pattern starts to reveal itself, not through words, but through the steady accumulation of what isn't happening. And once that pattern becomes visible, the ambiguity starts to collapse into something more defined. The silence begins to speak. Silence, when prolonged, stops being neutral. The body begins to respond to it the way it responds to any unresolved stimulus, with hypervigilance, with scanning, with low-grade activation that never fully settles. This isn't conscious. It happens beneath thought, in the parts of the brain that track safety and connection. Emotional withdrawal from someone who was once present registers as a shift in the environment. The nervous system doesn't interpret absence as peace, it interprets it as data. And when that data remains unresolved, the body stays alert, waiting for clarification that doesn't come. This is where relationship psychology becomes physiological. The mind might rationalize the silence. They're busy. They need time. It's fine. But the body doesn't buy it. Heart rate varies slightly when the phone vibrates. Sleep becomes lighter. Focus drifts toward the question of whether they'll reach out. These aren't dramatic reactions. They're subtle, persistent, and exhausting. Behavior analysis shows that absence, when it replaces presence, becomes its own kind of presence. The person isn't there, but the awareness of their absence is. And that awareness demands energy. What complicates this further is that the response often feels irrational. There's no threat, no emergency, just someone not texting back as quickly, not calling as often, not showing up in the small ways they used to. But attachment patterns don't operate on logic. They operate on consistency. When consistency breaks, the nervous system flags it. Emotional behavior begins to shift in response, not to what's happening, but to what's not. The silence becomes a presence in itself, a weight that follows every thought, every decision, every moment of distraction that doesn't quite distract enough. And the longer it lasts, the more the body adapts to it. Not by calming down, but by recalibrating what normal feels like. The low hum of uncertainty becomes background noise. The hypervigilance becomes routine. Psychological dynamics shift from reaction to accommodation. The silence is no longer an event. It's the new baseline. And once that happens, the emotional distance doesn't feel like distance anymore. It feels like the relationship itself. The absence has replaced the connection, quietly, without announcement. The body knows this before the mind will admit it. Once is circumstance. Twice is coincidence. 3 times is a pattern. The absences start to layer. Unanswered texts, postponed plans, responses that come hours late with no acknowledgement of the delay. Each one alone feels explainable. Together, they form something else. Relationship patterns begin to emerge not from what's said, but from what consistently doesn't happen. The behavior repeats, and repetition is language. It communicates priority, investment, and presence, or the lack of all 3. The mind resists seeing it at first because seeing it means confronting what it implies. This is where emotional behavior becomes difficult to deny. The person on the receiving end starts noticing the rhythm, the delay, the distance, the quiet that arrives at the same emotional temperature every time. There's no anger, no explanation, no conflict. Just a steady, repeating absence that never quite resolves. Behavior analysis identifies this as a shift in relational investment. where one person's energy decreases incrementally, almost imperceptibly, until the imbalance becomes structural. The other person compensates, filling the space with effort, with patience, with hope that the pattern will reverse. It rarely does. What makes this phase so psychologically disorienting is the lack of confrontation. Nothing is being said. Nothing is being refused. The relationship continues, technically, but its emotional architecture has changed. Psychological dynamics show that humans adapt to patterns, even painful ones, when those patterns remain consistent. The absence becomes predictable. The silence becomes familiar. And familiarity, even when uncomfortable, feels safer than uncertainty. So the pattern continues, and the person experiencing it begins to question their own perception. Maybe it's not that bad. Maybe they're overreacting. Maybe it's just stress, just timing, just life. But patterns don't lie. They reveal priority in a way words never do. Every repeated absence is a choice, even when it's framed as circumstance. Emotional distance grows not from a single moment, but from the accumulation of small, repeated withdrawals that never get addressed. And once the pattern is established, it becomes the new structure of the relationship. The silence is no longer an interruption. It's the baseline. And the question starts to shift, not whether the pattern exists, but whether it will ever change. The answer is usually already visible. The mind begins to work harder in the absence of information. Questions multiply, quietly, persistently, without resolution. Did I say something wrong? Are they losing interest? Is this temporary or permanent? The silence offers no answers, so the brain generates them, testing theories, replaying conversations, searching for the moment things shifted. Relationship psychology shows that humans need feedback loops to regulate emotional behavior. When those loops break, the internal questioning intensifies. The person starts monitoring their own actions more carefully, adjusting tone, timing, intensity, hoping to restore balance. But the silence doesn't respond to adjustment. It just continues. This is where psychological dynamics begin to erode self-trust. Without external confirmation, the mind turns inward, second-guessing its own read of the situation. Maybe the distance isn't real. Maybe it's projection. Maybe they're just busy and everything is fine. But the nervous system knows better. Attachment patterns recognize withdrawal, even when the conscious mind resists naming it. The body feels the imbalance, the one-sided effort, the absence of reciprocity, the growing sense that connection is being maintained by only one person. And that awareness, even when suppressed, creates a low-grade anxiety that colors every interaction. What makes this phase so exhausting is the lack of closure. The questions don't resolve. They loop endlessly because there's no data to settle them. Behavior analysis shows that ambiguity in relationships is more destabilizing than clarity, even painful clarity. At least pain has direction. Ambiguity just floats, unanchored, impossible to address or escape. The person caught in it starts to feel trapped, not by the other person, but by their own inability to know what's real. And in that space, emotional behavior becomes reactive, shaped more by fear of loss than by present reality. And still, the silence continues. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't soften or sharpen. It just remains, steady and unyielding, while the internal questioning grows louder. The mind keeps searching for an answer that makes sense, a reason that restores logic to the situation. But the answer isn't hidden. It's already present in the pattern itself. The silence is the message. The absence is the choice. And the longer it takes to accept that, the deeper the emotional distance becomes. The question isn't why it's happening. It's whether it will ever be acknowledged. When feedback stops, assumption takes over. The mind fills the void with narrative, constructing meaning from silence because silence itself offers none. Maybe they're overwhelmed. Maybe they're scared. Maybe they still care but don't know how to show it. These assumptions feel generous, even protective, but they're also survival mechanisms, ways to preserve hope in the absence of evidence. Relationship dynamics shift here, because assumptions replace reality. The person experiencing the silence starts responding not to what's happening, but to what they've decided is happening. And that gap between perception and truth becomes the new foundation of the relationship. This is where emotional behavior begins to distort. Without direct communication, every small interaction gets overanalyzed. A brief reply is read as warmth. A delay is read as rejection. Psychological dynamics show that humans in ambiguous relational states become hyper-attuned to micro-signals, searching for confirmation in places it doesn't exist. Behavior analysis reveals that this process is exhausting and often inaccurate. The assumptions formed in silence are rarely aligned with the other person's actual emotional state, but they feel real, because they're all there is to work with. And once assumptions solidify, they shape behavior, leading to reactions based on imagined intent rather than observable fact. What makes this dangerous is that assumptions feel like understanding. They create a false sense of clarity, a story that explains the silence in a way that preserves the relationship. But stories built in the absence of communication are fragile. They collapse the moment reality contradicts them, and reality, when it finally surfaces, often does. Emotional distance grows not because of what's said, but because of the gap between what's assumed and what's true. The person experiencing the silence operates from one narrative. The person creating it operates from another. And neither narrative ever meets. The longer this continues, the more detached both people become, not just from each other, but from the actual state of the relationship. Attachment patterns start to fray because connection requires shared reality, and shared reality requires communication. Without it, two people can occupy the same relationship while living in entirely different emotional worlds. The assumptions multiply, the silence deepens, and the distance, once psychological, begins to feel structural. The relationship still exists, technically, but the emotional foundation beneath it has quietly eroded. And no assumption, no matter how carefully constructed, can rebuild what communication alone sustains. Balance in relationship psychology depends on reciprocity. Effort met with effort, presence met with presence, investment returned in kind. When one person withdraws, even subtly, the other often compensates, increasing their output to restore equilibrium. But compensation only works when both people are operating from the same intention. When one person's silence is deliberate and the other's effort is reactive, the balance doesn't restore. It inverts. Emotional behavior becomes asymmetrical. The person pulling away gains distance. The person holding on loses ground. And the dynamic shifts into something neither person consciously chose, but both are now living inside. This is where psychological dynamics become self-reinforcing. The more one person reaches, the more space the other needs. The more space the other takes, the more the first person reaches. Neither is wrong. Both are responding to the same imbalance, but in opposite directions. Behavior analysis shows that this pattern, once established, is difficult to reverse without direct communication. And direct communication is precisely what the silence has eliminated. So the loop continues. One person pursues connection. The other retreats from pressure. And the emotional distance grows, not from cruelty or indifference, but from two incompatible responses to the same relational breakdown. What makes this so painful is that both people often feel misunderstood. The person withdrawing may feel overwhelmed, suffocated by expectation, needing room that isn't being granted. The person reaching may feel abandoned, confused by the sudden shift, desperate to restore what once felt natural. Neither sees the other's experience clearly because attachment patterns cloud perception. Emotional withdrawal looks like rejection to someone seeking closeness. Emotional pursuit looks like control to someone needing space. And the lack of response, steady, consistent, unyielding, becomes the only constant in a dynamic that has lost its center. The balance doesn't just shift, it collapses. And once it does, the relationship operates from two entirely different emotional realities. One person is trying to reconnect. The other is trying to breathe. Neither can succeed because the framework itself is broken. Relationship patterns reveal that imbalances, when left unaddressed, don't self-correct. They deepen. And the longer the silence persists, the wider the gap becomes. Eventually, the effort to restore balance stops feeling worth the cost. And that's when the dynamic stops being about connection. It becomes about survival, of dignity, of self, of the parts of a person that can't afford to keep reaching into a void that never reaches back. The mind begins to split. One part holds on to the possibility that things will shift, that the silence will break, the distance will close, the connection will return. The other part knows quietly that it won't. This internal oscillation is exhausting. Relationship psychology shows that ambiguity depletes emotional resources faster than clarity, even when clarity is painful. Hope and resignation alternate, sometimes within the same hour, and neither offers relief. Hope keeps the person tethered to a version of the relationship that may no longer exist. Resignation prepares them for a loss they aren't ready to accept. And the silence, unbroken, offers no resolution to either. This is where emotional behavior becomes self-focused, not out of selfishness, but out of necessity. The person experiencing the withdrawal stops directing their energy outward and begins directing it inward, trying to stabilize, to make sense, to protect themselves from the growing awareness that something fundamental has changed. Psychological dynamics shift from connection-seeking to self-preservation. The question is no longer, how do I bring them back, but how do I survive this? And that shift, though necessary, marks a turning point. The relationship, emotionally, has already begun to end. What remains is the acknowledgement. What makes this phase so isolating is that the struggle is invisible. From the outside, nothing has happened. There's no breakup, no argument, no definable event. Just a person quietly unraveling in response to an absence no one else can see. Behavior analysis shows that emotional withdrawal impacts the person left behind far more acutely than the person doing the withdrawing. One has already begun the process of separation. The other is still trying to hold on. And the emotional distance between those two states is vast. One person has moved on, internally, while the other hasn't been told there's anywhere to move from. And so the oscillation continues. Hope flares when a message comes through, even a brief one. Resignation settles in when hours pass with nothing. The emotional energy required to manage this swing is immense, and it leaves little room for anything else. Attachment patterns that once felt secure now feel fragile, conditional, uncertain. The person begins to lose trust, not just in the other person, but in their own perception. Maybe they're imagining it. Maybe it's not that bad. Maybe tomorrow will be different, but tomorrow rarely is. And the hope, slowly, begins to feel less like optimism and more like delay. The resignation isn't far behind. At a certain point, the relationship stops functioning as a mutual exchange and becomes a surveillance operation. One person watches, waits, tracks, interprets, monitoring the other's behavior for signs of shift, for proof of investment, for evidence that the connection still exists. Relationship dynamics that once felt natural now require constant analysis. Every interaction is measured. Every silence is timed. Every response is decoded for emotional temperature. This isn't connection, it's vigilance. And vigilance over time erodes the very thing it's trying to protect. This is where emotional behavior becomes unrecognizable. The person doing the monitoring doesn't recognize themselves in it. They've become someone who checks timestamps, rereads messages, calculates response delays. They're not paranoid. They're responding to a pattern that has trained them to expect inconsistency. Behavior analysis shows that humans adapt to relational environments, even toxic ones, by developing coping mechanisms that allow them to function within dysfunction. One-sided emotional monitoring is one of those mechanisms. It creates the illusion of control in a situation where control has already been lost. What makes this so corrosive is the loneliness embedded in it. The person monitoring is doing so alone. They're tracking someone who isn't tracking them back. Psychological dynamics reveal that reciprocity is the foundation of secure attachment. When reciprocity disappears, attachment becomes anxious, avoidant, or disorganized. The person left behind oscillates between clinging and withdrawing, between hope and despair, between believing the relationship can be saved and knowing it's already over. And the person who is emotionally withdrawn remains unreachable, not because they're cruel, but because they've already made a decision they haven't communicated. The monitoring doesn't bring clarity, it brings exhaustion. The person doing it becomes hyper-aware of every micro-absence, every delay, every moment that confirms what they already fear. Emotional distance is no longer something they're trying to close. It's something they're trying to survive. And in that shift, the relationship changes completely. It's no longer about two people. It's about one person trying to hold on to a connection that the other has quietly, steadily, already let go of. Reciprocity hasn't just faded, it's disappeared. And once it's gone, what remains isn't a relationship, it's a pattern. And patterns, once established, are extraordinarily difficult to break. There comes a moment when the silence stops being ambiguous and becomes undeniable. It's not one thing. It's the accumulation of every unanswered text, every canceled plan, every interaction that once felt easy and now feels like effort. Relationship psychology shows that awareness often arrives slowly, then all at once. The mind resists the truth until the evidence becomes overwhelming, and then, suddenly, it's impossible to unsee. The silence isn't temporary. It isn't about space or stress or timing. It's a choice. And that choice has been communicated, clearly and consistently through behavior. The realization doesn't bring relief. It brings a different kind of weight, the weight of finally knowing. This is where emotional behavior shifts from reactive to responsive. The person who has been waiting, monitoring, hoping, begins to stop. Not because they've given up, but because the cost of continuing has become too high. Psychological dynamics reveal that humans can tolerate uncertainty longer than they can tolerate self-abandonment. And at a certain point, the effort to sustain a one-sided connection begins to feel like a betrayal of the self. Behavior analysis shows that this moment, though painful, is often the beginning of clarity. The silence is no longer something to interpret, it's something to acknowledge. And acknowledgement, though it doesn't erase the pain, allows movement. What makes this moment so significant is that it requires no conversation. The other person doesn't have to confirm the distance. They've already confirmed it, repeatedly, through their absence. Emotional distance that was once psychological becomes factual. The relationship as it existed is over. What remains is the decision of what to do with that knowledge. Attachment patterns that once kept the person tethered begin to loosen. Not because love has disappeared, but because the structure that held the relationship together has collapsed. And without that structure, the connection cannot be sustained, no matter how much one person wants it to be. The silence reaches its conclusion, not in words, but in recognition. The impact can no longer be softened, explained away, or reframed. It simply is. And in that acknowledgement, something shifts. The person who has been holding on begins, slowly, to let go. Not because they're ready, but because staying has become unsustainable. Relationship patterns end this way more often than people admit. Not with confrontation or closure, but with a quiet, internal knowing that arrives long before it's spoken. The silence has done its work. It has communicated everything it needed to. And the only question left is whether the person receiving it will listen. The silence after a breakup is not a pause. It's a process. And by the time most people recognize it for what it is, the psychological dynamics have already shifted beyond repair. What begins as space becomes distance. What feels like ambiguity becomes clarity, just not the kind anyone hoped for. Relationship patterns don't end dramatically. They end quietly, in the accumulation of unanswered moments, in the steady withdrawal of presence, in the silence that never breaks because it was never meant to. Understanding this doesn't undo it. But it does something more important. It stops you from misreading absence as anything other than what it is. A choice. Repeated. Consistent. Clear. The impact of that silence doesn't disappear when you finally name it. But naming it allows you to stop waiting for it to mean something else. Emotional behavior recalibrates once certainty replaces hope. Attachment patterns begin to loosen when the mind stops fighting what the body already knows. The silence spoke. You heard it. And what comes next isn't about them. It's about whether you'll keep listening to a message that's already been delivered, or whether you'll start listening to yourself instead. Behavior analysis shows that clarity, even painful clarity, restores agency. And agency is what allows movement, not back, forward. But here's what most people miss, and it's the part that makes all of this make sense. The silence you're sitting in now, it didn't start when the breakup happened. It started long before that. The psychological dynamics, the emotional withdrawal, the behavioral patterns that led to this moment, they were already in motion. You just didn't see them yet. And if you want to understand what actually happened, if you want to stop replaying the ending and start seeing the structure that built it, you need to go back further. You need to see what was already breaking before anyone said it was over. That's exactly what I walked through in the previous video. The breakup didn't start when it ended. It's not about closure. It's not about blame. It's about the invisible fractures that form in relationships long before the final silence. The patterns you didn't recognize while you were inside them. The emotional distance that accumulated before distance became physical. If you've been trying to make sense of how things fell apart, that video will show you what you've been missing. It's the context this silence is built on. And without that context, you're only seeing half the picture. If this resonated, if any of this felt familiar, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This is the kind of work we do here. Behavioral analysis, relationship psychology, the patterns most people don't talk about because they're uncomfortable to name. But naming them is the only way through. There's more coming. You'll want to see it.